The manifest listed it as Lot 9, Gamma, one sealed alien cryopod, composite casing, origin undetermined, condition inert, estimated resale value, 0. Reserve bid, 1 standard credit, which was the Vethera Drift's way of saying they had given up on the thing and only wanted it off the floor. I bid 1 credit, and nobody else raised their paddle. That was how it always went with the dead lots. The serious buyers, the ones who came to the Drift's monthly auction with tablets and appraisers and enough credit to fill a cargo hold, they read the manifest, they scanned for active power signatures, and if the scanner returned nothing, they moved on. They were in the business of turning inventory into margin, not into mystery. Dead was dead. A sealed pod with no detectable life sign and no legible provenance was not an opportunity. It was a liability. It took up space. It could not be opened without risk. And the glyphs etched into its casing had defeated every translation algorithm the Drift had run at it over the better part of a decade. I knew all of that when I raised my paddle. I raised it anyway. The auction floor at the Drift smells like recycled air and old machine oil and the particular chemical note that alien composite materials give off when they have been sitting in a pressurized bay long enough. I have been standing on that floor one morning a month, most months, for 18 years. I know exactly what it feels like to see a lot come up on the display board and feel the room's collective attention slide past it, that slight, collective exhale of 100 buyers deciding, simultaneously, that something is not worth their time. The body language is distinctive. Tablets lowered. Feet shifted. A few people pull out of the row to get a better look at the next lot, already staged behind the curtain. That exhale moved through the room when Lot 9, Gamma, came up. I had seen the pod before the auction, in the preview walk. I had run my scanner over it, and gotten nothing. The same nothing the Drift's own equipment had been returning for years. And I had stood there for a moment, longer than my results justified, looking at the glyph band, with the specific feeling I sometimes get in front of things I cannot explain. It is not excitement. Exactly. More like the sensation of a question being asked in a frequency I cannot quite hear. My mother used to call it the hold feeling, the feeling that something belonged in the hold for a while. She had it, she said, reliably. I had inherited it less cleanly. But I had inherited something. I knew all of that when I raised my paddle. I raised it anyway. My name is Sarah Odiambo. I am 44 years old, and I have been buying dead alien hardware at Vethera Drift auctions since I was 26, which is the year my mother retired and handed me the access codes to our family's rented hold in Bay 17. Before me, it was my mother. Before her, it was her mother, Adanya, who had found the Drift at the age of 31 when it was still a much smaller station and a much wilder market, and who had first rented the hold that eventually passed to me. We are not a famous family. We are not wealthy. We buy things that no one else wants, and we try to understand them. And sometimes, we sell them for a modest profit, and sometimes, we keep them because they seem to want keeping. I could not have explained, in the auction bay that morning, why I raised my paddle for Lot 9 Gamma. It was not a reasoned decision. The pod was listed as inert. My scanner, an older model, but reliable, had returned the same nothing the Drift's own equipment had been returning for years. No power draw. No thermal differential. No atmospheric signature from inside. The casing was smooth composite, black and dense, and the glyphs that ran in a continuous band around its equatorial seam were inert in the way stone is inert. They looked like they had been carved there before anyone currently living was born, and had no intention of doing anything but being carved. The pod was roughly the size and shape of a standard human pressure coffin, which is to say, it was designed to hold one occupant, but everything else about it was wrong. The casing material was not any alloy in the Drift's materials database. The seam, if it was a seam, showed no join line under magnification. It appeared to be a single continuous object, which should have been impossible given that something must once have gone inside. There were buyers in that room who had spent more on breakfast that morning than I paid for the pod. I rolled it on a rented grav plate back to Bay 17, locked the hold door behind me, and set it in the corner next to a defunct relay antenna from the Gavari cluster, and 3 sealed crates of unidentified atmospheric processors that I had bought 18 months ago and not yet gotten around to cataloging. Then I went to bed. It was late. The pod was going nowhere. That was the 21st of the month. For the next 3 weeks, the pod sat in the corner of Bay 17 and did nothing, which was exactly what the manifest had promised it would do. I did not ignore it, precisely. I checked it every morning the way you check anything in a hold. A visual pass, a quick scanner sweep, a note in the log. Nothing. No change. The glyph band stayed stone still. The casing stayed room temperature, which was 21 degrees standard, same as the hold. The mass reading stayed consistent at what the drift's floor scale had recorded at auction. Everything about it was exactly, precisely, utterly inert. I found myself talking to it on the 3rd day. I did not intend to. I was cataloging the atmospheric processors, a tedious job that involves a lot of waiting for test cycles to complete, and I had the sort of low-level, unfocused attention that makes you do things without planning to. I said something like, "Not going to tell me anything, are you?" And then I felt slightly ridiculous, and then I went back to the processors. My mother used to talk to the hardware. She said it helped her think. Her mother did it too. There are notes in the old hold logs that show Adanya addressing individual pieces of equipment by informal names she had given them, which was eccentric even by the loose standards of the drift. I had always assumed it was a habit that had not quite passed down to me. Apparently I was wrong. The talking became a routine. Not elaborate, a sentence or two when I came in the morning, another when I left at night. I told the pod what I was working on. I noted the weather, which at a station like the drift means the traffic pattern and the docking queue, and which bay access corridors were having pressure issues. I observed once that it had very nice glyphs, and I wished I knew what they meant. It did not respond. I did not expect it to. But I stopped feeling ridiculous. On the 23rd day, I was doing a full inventory of Bay 17, which I do every quarter and which is one of the least interesting tasks associated with my work. Inventory means physically touching every item in the hold and cross-referencing it against the log. Some of the items in Bay 17 are small enough to handle directly. Others require the grav plate. The atmospheric processors I had to number by hand, crouching between them with a marker stylus, which put me in a back corner of the hold for about 40 minutes, with a crick in my neck. When I finally stood up and stretched, I was standing directly in front of the pod. I put my hand on it. It was not a deliberate gesture. I was steadying myself as I straightened the muscles in my lower back, had decided they had opinions about 40 minutes in a crouch, and the nearest surface to reach for was the pod's casing. My palm went flat against it, just above the glyph band, and I leaned into it for a moment while my back complained and then quieted. The casing was warm. I stood very still. I had been in Bay 17 for nearly 2 hours. The hold temperature had not changed. The pod had been reading at ambient temperature every morning for 23 days. But under my palm, the composite casing was distinctly, unmistakably warm. Not hot, not feverish, but warm, in the way a living thing is warm. The warmth of something that has a temperature of its own. I did not pull my hand away. I am not sure why. Some part of me understood, on a level that bypassed the part of me that assesses risk for a living, that pulling my hand away was the wrong move. The glyphs began to move. Not all at once. The first one, it was directly beneath my palm, and I could feel a faint vibration as it shifted, changed its shape. I could not see it from my angle, but I felt the casing surface alter under my hand. A subtle texture change, like running your finger across a page and feeling the impression of old ink. Then, the one to its left. Then, the one to its right. A slow sequence, propagating outward from the point of contact. The band of glyphs beginning to rotate and reconfigure, like the tumblers of an extraordinarily complex lock. I heard something, very faint, through the composite. A sound like a long breath being taken. My scanner was on my belt. I unclipped it one-handed. I kept my other palm on the casing and raised it. The display was not showing nothing. It was showing something. A power signature, low and building, in a frequency range I had never seen on that device or any other. Not electrical, not thermal in any conventional sense. Something else. The scanner logged it and then, about 15 seconds after I unclipped it, displayed a small amber indicator that meant unknown classification and stopped trying to quantify the reading. The glyph band completed one full rotation. Then it stopped. The warmth under my hand intensified slightly, not uncomfortably, but noticeably. And then, the pod spoke. Not in any language I knew. Not in any language the drift's translation systems would have recognized. I was nearly certain. It was sound, but it was not precisely speech. It was more like speech had been reduced to its fundamental intention and expressed as something between frequency and meaning. I heard it with my ears, but I understood it somewhere else. Not in the language centers of my brain, which I know as a sort of specific processing sensation, a feeling of decoding. I understood it the way you understand that a room has changed while you were not watching, as a fact that is simply there, in you, without being placed there by any normal mechanism. It said, "You are the key I kept." I stood in Bay 17 with my palm flat against a 9,000-year-old alien cryopod, and I did not move for a long time. The warmth under my hand did not abate. The glyphs held their new configuration. Whatever sequence they had settled into after that single rotation was clearly the arrival state, not a transient one. My scanner's amber indicator continued to pulse steadily, flagging the power signature as it built. I became aware, slowly, that the sound the pod had made, that not quite speech, that communication delivered somewhere below the level of language, had left a residue. Not words exactly, more like the shape of a context. A sense of having been addressed by name, correctly, after a very long wait. A sense, underneath that, of extraordinary patience rewarded. You are the key I kept. I turned that over carefully, while the hold stayed quiet around me. Bay 17 is not a large space. The defunct antenna sat behind me on its pallet, and the atmospheric processors occupied the left-hand wall, and the various other lots I had accumulated over the past quarter made a familiar landscape of stacked cases and draped equipment. The pod sat at the center of it all, warm under my hand, finally and irrevocably not dead. I am a practical person. I have been buying alien hardware for 18 years, and I have seen things at Vethera Drift that surprised me, and one or two things that frightened me, and a handful of things that I would categorize as genuinely unexplained. But I am not, by temperament, a person who reaches for the mystical when the mechanical is still an option. What I did, in those first minutes after the pod spoke, was run through the mechanical options. Active power source, finally triggered, possible. Some alien technology is extraordinarily patient. I had once bought a relay module that had been inert for 300 years before a specific signal frequency triggered its boot sequence. But 300 years was very different from 9,000. And the trigger mechanism, if that was what had happened, was my hand on the casing, which implied a biological sensor, which implied something very specific about what was being sensed. That was where the mechanical options ran out. The pod had not activated because I touched it. It had activated because I touched it. The difference is the entire thing. I thought about my mother. I thought about Adanya, whose hold logs I had read all the way back to her first year at the Drift, in a spirit of family archaeology that I had always told myself was practical. Adanya had written about the things she bought the way some people write about animals they have rescued, with a directness and a lack of sentimentality that was somehow more tender than sentiment would have been. She had a piece in her hold for 11 years before she understood what it was. She never discarded anything she could not explain. She called it bad practice, not to understand what you owned before you sold it. She called it disrespectful. My mother had said the same things in different words. I had grown up hearing it. It was, I had always assumed, a philosophy about thoroughness, a professional standard, something that set us apart from the dealers who bought and flipped without looking. I stood in Bay 17 and thought about what it would mean if it was something more than that. 9,000 years is not a number. The human mind processes naturally. I know this, because I tried to process it, and what my mind did instead was produce a series of historical reference, the oldest human writing systems, the earliest settled agriculture, civilizations that had risen and fallen, and been buried, and been dug up again, and even stacked together, Those references did not fill the space. 9,000 years ago, measured against a cryopod that had been dormant since before those writing systems existed, is a long time to wait for a specific hand. And, yet, I was not chosen at random. I understood that with a clarity that had no words attached to it. Only the residue of the pod's communication. I was the most recent member of a lineage that the pod had been tracking, not by blood, I did not think, but by practice. By the specific, stubborn, slightly irrational practice of acquiring things everyone else had given up on and keeping them with care and refusing to let them go unexamined. The pod had been in the drift's inventory for 43 years, according to the manifest. In that time it had passed through 3 rounds of formal auctions and had not sold. It had spent years in back storage. It had been scanned 6 times by the drift's equipment, and each time returned nothing. 4 individual buyers had taken it on consignment and returned it. The drift had twice considered scrapping it, deconstructing the casing to sell the composite material, and each time, the cost estimate for cryopod deconstruction had come out higher than the projected scrap value, so they had left it. 43 years. 9,043 years, total. I thought about what it felt like to wait. I do not know what the pod contains. I knew that then, too. Standing in the hold, the pod had spoken, but it had not opened. The seam I had been unable to identify under magnification still showed no join line. Whatever is inside, whoever is inside, if anyone still is, was not yet visible. What I had received was acknowledgement, recognition, a message delivered across 9,000 years, and 1 credit's worth of auction floor, arriving in my palm like a fact that had always been true. You are the key I kept. I stayed with my hand on the casing for a long time after that, not because I expected it to speak again, but because it seemed like the right thing to do. It had waited 9,000 years. The least I could offer was patience in return. Eventually I became aware that I was hungry, which is the body's way of insisting on its own agenda regardless of what the mind is doing. I lowered my scanner back to my belt. I left my hand on the pod for another moment. Then I said, aloud, in the voice I had been using for 3 weeks to talk to the hardware in Bay 17. I heard you. I'll figure out what to do next. And then I went and got something to eat. I want to be careful about the next part, because there is a version of it that sounds more dramatic than it was, and a version that sounds less dramatic, and neither is right. What I did over the following week was research. The drift has an archive, not a grand one, but a functional one, maintained by a small staff who are deeply committed to the proposition that information about alien technology should be recorded and accessible. I have used the archive many times in my career. The staff there know my face and my name, and the specific way I ask questions, which is to come in with a list already formed and work through it methodically. I used it differently this time. I started with the glyph band. The drift's translation systems had been unable to parse it, but they had logged image captures from each of the 6 scans, and those image captures were in the archive. What they had not done, what it had apparently not occurred to anyone to do, was compare the captures from before and after the pod was acquired. I had the 7th scan now, my own, which had been running when the glyphs shifted. I pulled all 7 captures and put them side by side. The shift was visible. The pre-activation glyphs had a particular geometry. Each individual symbol was symmetrical, or near symmetrical, closed in on itself. The post-activation configuration was different. The glyphs had opened. That was the only way I could describe it. The symbols that had been closed form had become directional. They were pointing somewhere. I spent 2 days trying to understand where. The archive's alien linguistics database is not exhaustive. No database of that kind can be, but it is one of the more comprehensive ones in this region of space, and I have a passing familiarity with about a dozen written systems from the use of the archive over the years. The archivist on duty the second day, a careful, unhurried man named Esev, who has been maintaining that database for longer than I have been coming to the drift, looked over my shoulder at the image captures for a while without speaking, and then said that the glyph forms reminded him of something he had seen in a consignment of materials from the outer Trav corridor about 6 years ago. He pulled those records. The match was partial, but it was there. Nothing in the database matched the pod's glyphs precisely. But there were partial overlaps, fragments, structures that appeared in multiple scripts in slightly different forms, the way certain letter shapes persist across languages that developed independently because the human hand, or whatever appendage makes the marks, has a limited set of natural motions. What I found, across 3 different database entries for extinct or poorly documented alien scripts, was a recurring symbol cluster that appeared in each case in contexts associated with safekeeping. Not storage that was a different cluster, one that showed up more often and in more scripts. Safekeeping specifically, with connotations of active tending. A thing not merely put away but continuously maintained, cared for. I sat with that for a while. Then I went back to the hold logs. Adania's logs go back 61 years, to her first year at the Drift, which means they go back to when she was 31 years old. They are meticulous in the way that practical records made by practical people tend to be meticulous. Not organized for an outside reader, but organized for the person making them, which means they reward close reading because everything important has been recorded, even if it was not labeled as important. I had read the logs before, but not looking for what I was looking for now. What I was looking for now was any mention of a sealed pod, or of a piece of hardware with a smooth composite casing and an untranslated glyph band, or of anything that had spent time in Bay 17 and might have passed out of my grandmother's hands before reaching the Drift's formal inventory. I found something, but it was not quite that. On the 37th page of the second year's logs, Adania had written, "Returned the Gavari lot to Marsit all except the sealed case." He wanted the sealed case as part of the bundle, but I told him it was not for sale. I do not know why I said this. When he asked why it was not for sale, I told him it needed more work, which is not untrue, but also not the reason. I will think about it more. 14 pages later, in what appeared to be a different entry style written at a different time, in slightly different handwriting, the sealed case is still here. I have been here 9 months now. I clean it every week when I clean the rest of the hold. Nothing has changed about it, but I think something about it has changed in me. I do not know what it is yet. I turned through the rest of the second year's logs. The sealed case was mentioned 4 more times, always in passing, always without explanation. In the final entry of that year, Adania had written, "I sold the sealed case to Turvin's lot today for what it cost me. Not sorry. I think it needed to be somewhere it would be kept properly. Turvin is careful with things." I stopped reading. Turvin's lot. Turvin was not a name I recognized from the Drift's current vendor registry, but the archive's historical records went back far enough. Turvin Odiambo, my grandmother, had acquired the name by marriage 3 years after those log entries, which meant Turvin was my grandfather, or had become my grandfather, or was about to. She had sold a sealed alien case to the man she would later marry, whom she had described as careful with things. I sat in the archive room for a long time. My grandfather had been a dealer too. Though not at the Drift, he had worked the Velhari Transit Market, which is about 40 light minutes from here, and he had retired before I was old enough to remember him clearly. What I remembered was a large, quiet man who kept a very orderly workshop and who had taught my mother, when she was young, how to assess alien hardware without touching it before you understood what you were touching. He had died when my mother was 19. She had inherited his workshop inventory, which had eventually been folded into her own stock, which had eventually become part of what she passed to me. I had never cataloged that inherited stock in full. There was too much of it, and most of it was too familiar, pieces I had grown up around and had stopped truly seeing because they were part of the furniture of my professional life. Things that had been in the hold long before I arrived, and that I kept because getting rid of them seemed more trouble than storing them. I knew, before I went back to the hold, what I was going to find. The sealed case my grandmother had sold to my grandfather was not the pod. I do not want to give the wrong impression. The timeline was wrong, and the description was wrong, and the pod's 43 years in Drift inventory was documented. But the sealed case pointed at something. It pointed at a practice, a habit, a pattern of behavior that I could now see threading through 3 generations of my family like a seam through composite. Adania would not sell the sealed case when a buyer wanted it. She kept it until she understood it better. She sold it to someone she trusted to keep it well. My grandfather had kept it carefully. My mother had kept his inventory. I had kept her inventory. And at some point in that chain I could not say exactly where, and I am not sure it matters, something about us had become legible to the thing waiting in Bay 17. The pod had not been tracking blood. I was increasingly certain of that. What it had been tracking was something harder to name but easier to recognize when you saw it. The specific quality of attention that my family brought to the things in our care. The refusal to discard without understanding. The weekly cleaning that Adanya mentioned. The thoroughness that my grandfather taught my mother. The daily scanner check and the inventory pass. And the quiet 2 sentences in the morning when you came into the hold. Addressed to the hardware. Because it seemed like the right thing to do. The pod had been looking for a keeper. And it had waited until it found one of us. I went back to Bay 17. The pod was exactly as I had left it. Warm, glyphs in their post-activation configuration. Power signature still registering on my scanner at that steady, building amber. I had been gone for most of the day. I stood in the doorway for a moment before going in. The way you pause before rejoining a conversation you have stepped away from. I found some things, I said. I'm going to tell you about them. I am aware that this sounds strange. I am aware that talking to alien hardware is, by most reasonable standards, strange regardless of context, and that talking to alien hardware that has already spoken to you and acknowledged your presence is stranger still, rather than less strange. I cannot make it sound less strange. I can only tell it the way it was. I walked to the pod and I put my hand back on the casing. It was warmer than before. Noticeably warmer, as if the time I had been away had allowed something inside to continue the process of becoming, and I talked for probably 20 minutes. I told the pod about Adanya, and about the sealed case, and about my grandfather, and about the chain of custody that had brought both me and it to Bay 17. I told it about the glyph analysis. I told it about the word cluster the archive had found across 3 extinct scripts, the one that meant safekeeping, with connotations of active tending. I did not know if it understood me. I assumed it did. That assumption turned out not to be wrong. The seam appeared. It had not been there before. I am as certain of this as I am certain of anything about that time. Under magnification, under direct lighting. The casing had presented as a single, uninterrupted surface. I had checked. The drift's 6 scans had checked. And then, while my palm was flat against the casing, and I was telling the pod about my grandmother's hold log, a line appeared at the equatorial band, a hairline first, barely perceptible, and then widening as something inside the pod made a decision, or completed a process, or received what it needed to receive. I stepped back, not out of fear. Exactly, there is a kind of adrenaline that is not quite fear, and not quite excitement, and not quite reverence, but some compound of all 3. And what moved my feet was that I stepped back, and I waited. The seam continued to open. Slowly. The process was deliberate, unhurried, 9,000 years of patience, expressed in the final millimeters of a seal releasing. The glyphs on the band cycled through one more configuration, slower than the first time, each symbol moving with a kind of finality, arriving at their last positions and holding there. Then the top half of the pod separated from the bottom and rose. The hold had been at standard atmospheric pressure and temperature for as long as I had maintained it. 21 degrees, standard mix, 1 atmosphere. Whatever the pod had done to its internal environment to preserve what was inside had worked. As the casing separated, I smelled something I could not immediately name: clean, cold, carrying a faint mineral note. Like air from a very deep and very old place. Not unpleasant. Ancient. I moved carefully forward. The inside of the pod was lined with a material that I did not recognize, fine-textured, self-luminous in a pale blue-white, the color of daylight at a high altitude. The lining had the look of something that had been maintained from the inside, which should not have been possible but clearly was. There was no degradation, no discoloration at the edges. No sign that 9,000 years had passed inside that casing. She was there. I want to be precise about this. I am going to be very careful and very precise. She was not alive in the way I am alive. She was not breathing. Her eyes were closed. She was about my height, and her build was similar to a human woman's in the broadest architectural sense, upright adapted, bilateral symmetry, the proportions of something that spent its evolutionary history navigating a ground-level environment in a gravity well of roughly similar strength to Earth's. But she was not human. Her skin had the texture and translucency of the pod's composite casing, and the same faint, self-luminous quality as the lining material. Her hands, folded on her chest, had 6 fingers. Her features peaceful, still, unmistakably the features of an intelligence that had had time to develop the rest of what makes a face. The lines of thought and experience and age were not human faces, but they were faces. She was 9,000 years old, and she was in one piece, and she was right here. The pod's power signature spiked on my scanner. I had it in my hand, having unclipped it reflexively when the seam opened, and the reading climbed from amber to a frequency range my display didn't have a color for, which was the device's way of expressing that it had reached the limit of what it was equipped to measure. Then the scanner display cleared and went to standby. The power source inside that pod had politely exceeded my equipment's rating and was doing so without any apparent effort. She opened her eyes. They were the color of the lining material, blue-white, self-luminous, carrying in them the specific quality of a thing that has been patient for a very long time and has arrived, at last, at the moment it was patient for. She did not look startled. She looked the way someone looks when they have been waiting, and the thing they were waiting for has finally come. A settling, a release of something long held, arriving in the features as a kind of stillness. She looked at my hand, still raised with the scanner in it. Then she looked at my face. She said something. I did not understand it. This was true language, not the direct impression communication the pod had used, and I had no template for it. But then she paused, and something shifted in her expression, a small recalibration, and she spoke again. The same thing, I thought, but with a different mechanism behind it. This time the direct impression carried meaning underneath the unfamiliar sound. You are the keeper's line. Yes, I said, I think so. She was still for a moment. Then she moved her hands from her chest slowly, with the deliberateness of a body reminding itself how motion works after 9,000 years of stillness, and placed them flat against the inner surface of the pod's lower half. Bracing herself to sit up, the movement was effortful, but not pained. More like purposeful. Like someone who had known they would be doing this, and had prepared for it. I put the scanner away and offered her my hand. She looked at it. Whatever she understood about human anatomy and human social convention after 9,000 years inside a sealed pod was unclear to me. But she seemed to understand the gesture. She placed one 6-fingered hand in mine, and I helped her sit upright, which was more work than it looked, because her mass was considerably greater than her size. Suggested the density difference of whatever she was made of, and my footing on the hold floor was not as solid as I would have liked. But we managed. She sat upright in the open pod, hands now folded in her lap, looking around Bay 17 with an expression I could not read precisely, but which seemed to contain something like assessment. The defunct relay antenna, the atmospheric processors, the stacked cases and the draped equipment. She looked at me. She said something that carried, underneath it. You kept this space. I do, I said. It's my hold. Something that might have been the longest version of satisfaction I have ever seen in a face pass through hers. I want to pause here, in the telling of this, and say something about what it felt like. I have spent 18 years in the salvage and resale business, which is a profession that tends to select for people who are comfortable with the genuinely unknown, the object of unknown origin, the piece with no manual and no provenance, and no analogous example anywhere in the databases. You develop a certain relationship with not knowing yet. It becomes a state you can occupy without discomfort, a waiting room you are practiced at sitting in. You learn that the not knowing is not a problem to be solved urgently. It is a condition to be respected while you gather what you need to move through it. But this, she was 9,000 years old. The civilization that had made her and I understood, in those first moments of her being upright and awake, that she had been made. She was not what I would call biological, in the way I am biological. Though she was clearly not simple machinery either, that civilization had existed when the oldest human settlements were new. They had made her, and they had made the pod, and they had sealed her inside and set the pod adrift in whatever transit corridor it had been drifting in, before the drift's trawlers had pulled it out of the black, and logged it as inert, and put it on a shelf. They had programmed the pod to wait for a keeper, not a king, not a warrior, not a priest or a scholar, or an heir to some ancient bloodline of power. A keeper, someone who picked up what others set down and did not leave it to rot, who cleaned the thing they did not understand, who stayed with what they had acquired long enough to begin to understand it, who talked to the hardware, who came back every morning with a scanner and a note in the log. That was the recognition criterion. That was what the glyphs had been measuring, across all those failed scans and all those buyers who had looked and moved on. Not DNA, not species, not rank or bloodline or cosmic destiny. Attentiveness, fidelity to what you owned. The refusal to give up on a thing because it was not yet useful. My grandmother had bought a different sealed case and kept it because something in her said it was not ready to be sold. She had sold it to my grandfather because he was careful with things. My grandfather had kept it until my mother inherited it. My mother had kept it and passed the habit of keeping to me along with everything else she passed. And somewhere in that chain, across those 3 generations of practice, we had become legible. We had become a keeper's line. She did not say much in those first hours. There were practical limitations. The communication mechanism required something from her that cost something, and she was 9,000 years out of sleep. I did not push. I made space in the hold where she could sit outside the pod. I brought water. She looked at it, tasted a drop from her fingertip, and set it aside without offense. I cleared a workbench where she could rest her hands. I talked, sometimes. In the rambling way I talked to the hardware about what was in the hold, about the drift, about the station's layout. She listened. Whatever her cognitive architecture, it was fast. By the second hour, she was processing what I said in a way that showed in her expression small, responsive shifts, the micro-adjustments of a mind, translating in real time. By the third hour, she said something that carried, under it, a question. How long? The pod's been in drift inventory for 43 years, I said. Before that, I don't know exactly. The casing and the composite are materials the archive doesn't have a match for. The glyphs overlap with extinct scripts the archive dates at 9 to 10,000 years. I paused. The archive's best estimate, based on 6 scans, was somewhere between 8 and 12,000 years. She processed this without visible reaction. Then she said something, and this time, the direct impression underneath it was more complex, not a single concept, but a cluster. Something like, the time was known, the duration was calculated. The pod was designed to hold this long. I had expected to wait. How long did you expect to wait? I asked. She looked at me steadily. Then she said something that carried, until someone kept me long enough. I sat with that for a moment. My grandmother had a sealed case. I said, different from this one, the timeline doesn't match. But she wrote about it. About not being able to sell it. About cleaning it every week while she thought about it. She did not react with surprise. She said something that carried, not the first. Not the first time your pod surfaced in our family? Something that carried, not the first keeper's line to find something of ours. There are others. There have always been others. I thought about that for a long time, in the hold, while she sat on my cleared workbench and looked around at everything I had accumulated over 18 years with the expression of someone taking an inventory of their own. There are others. There have always been others. 9,000 years ago, a civilization about which I know almost nothing, about which I may know almost nothing for a long time, because she is patient and thorough, and the communication mechanism is slow-going, and I am going to be careful about it. A civilization made her, and made the pod, and set them both adrift with a single encoded recognition. Criterion. Not for a king, not for a chosen one, for a keeper. And apparently, they had done this more than once. The thought that unfolds from that, if you sit with it long enough, is a large one. It is the thought of a civilization that had existed long enough and thought carefully enough about what it was leaving behind to know that what it needed to leave it with was not power, or heirs, or sealed instructions. It needed to leave it with someone who would keep it, who would stay with it past the point of obvious utility, who would clean it every week while thinking about it, who would come in the morning and say, "Not going to tell me anything, are you?" and then come back the next morning anyway. That was what they had trusted the universe to produce, and conserve, and eventually deliver. And across 9,000 years, however many drifting pods and sealed cases, and defunct relay modules, and atmospheric processors of unknown provenance had circulated through whatever version of the salvage market the universe had been running in that time it had. I am not the first keeper's line. She told me that. But I am, as far as I know, the current one. And that is enough to be going on with. She is still in Bay 17. I want to be careful about the next part too, because the next part is not finished yet, and I am not sure I should try to make it sound finished. What I can tell you is what is true so far. She has been awake for 11 weeks now. The communication between us has improved considerably. She has a facility for language acquisition that is, in my best assessment, significantly beyond what I would expect from anything, human or otherwise. And she seems to find the work of learning not taxing but interesting, in the way a very capable mind finds any problem that is worthy of it interesting. My standard is now something she can navigate in real time, imperfectly but functionally. Her native language remains beyond me. I have a few dozen symbols of it, enough to follow basic exchanges, but we get by. She has told me, in fragments, over those 11 weeks, some things about what is inside the pod that are not her. Stored materials. Records. Something she called a continuation index, which is a concept I do not yet fully understand, but which seems to be a very complete kind of archive, not just information but method. Not just method but intention. I have asked her to explain it several different ways, because I am a person who prefers to understand what I own before I rely on it, and she has been patient with all of my approaches. She does not seem to mind being asked the same question from a different angle. She said once, in her improving standard, that she expected as much. She has told me, with the flat matter-of-factness of someone who has had 9,000 years to come to terms with a fact, that the civilization that made her is gone. Not at war, not displaced, gone, in the ordinary way that enough time makes things go. It is not a grief, in her. It is more like a founding condition. She was made to outlast it. She knew she would. She had 11 weeks of sleep after 9,000 years of waiting to feel whatever there was to feel about that, and when she woke up, what she needed was not comfort, but a keeper. I asked her, in the 5th week, what I was keeping her for. She looked at me with the patience of something that has been patient for 9,000 years and said, "For the same reason your grandmother kept the sealed case, because it seemed like the right thing to do. And because," she added, "you will understand more later. Understanding takes time, and I have always been willing to give it." I believe her. I have always been in the business of not understanding things yet. I am practiced at occupying that waiting room. I come to it without discomfort. My scanner has had to be recalibrated twice since she woke. The power signature from the pod does not diminish, it continues to build. Steadily. At that frequency the original display could not classify. The Drift's dockmaster has asked me, twice, about the readings his systems are picking up from Bay 17. And I have told him I am running a long test sequence on some newly acquired equipment, which is not untrue. He accepted this with the mild skepticism of a man who has been managing this station for 20 years, and has learned that the dealers in the long-term holds are generally doing something unusual in there, and will tell him what it is, when they are ready. He is not wrong. What I know, that I did not know 3 months ago, is that the continuation index contains records of the other pods. Not many. She has not given me a number, but more than one. Scattered, waiting in various conditions of dormancy in various places across a wide volume of space that, in her civilization's time, constituted a reasonable travel radius, each one encoded with the same recognition criterion, or variations of it, suited to whatever form keeping takes in the species it will eventually encounter. There are, in other words, other keepers. Somewhere. People who have the habit, who pick up what others set down and do not let it go unexamined, who talk to the hardware, who come back every morning. She told me this not as instruction but as context, which is how she tends to deliver information. Here is the shape of what is true, she seems to say, and you will understand what to do with it, as you understand more. That is a reasonable way to handle someone who is still working through the fact that she bid 1 credit on an auction lot, and is now sitting with a 9,000-year-old intelligence in Bay 17, while the Dockmaster's equipment registers anomalous readings, and the pod's blue-white glow makes the corner of the hold look like very high-altitude sky. I bought her for 1 credit at an auction where nobody else raised a paddle. In the mornings, when I come into the hold, she is usually awake. She appears to require very little in the way of sleep. Now that she has slept for 9,000 years and she is usually doing something with the continuation index, accessing it in a way I cannot yet observe directly. She looks up when I come in. She says something in standard that she has made our morning exchange, a greeting that is practical and warm in the way that practical greetings can be warm. I say something back. Then we get to work. What the work is, exactly, is still becoming clear. What I know is this. My grandmother had a habit. My grandfather inherited the habit and refined it. My mother inherited it from him and passed it to me with everything else she passed. I carried it into Bay 17 for 23 days without knowing what I was carrying. And on the 23rd day, I put my hand on a casing that had been waiting for someone with that habit. And something 9,000 years old and extraordinarily patient said, in a frequency below the register of language, "You are the key I kept." And the only answer I had for it, the only answer that was true, was, yes, I think so. That answer was enough. It had always been enough. The pod had not been waiting for the right words or the right credentials or the right blood. It had been waiting for the right habit, expressed in the right hands, arriving in a hold that was clean and carefully maintained, and full of things that had not been discarded, because their keeper had not yet understood them. I think about Adanya sometimes, working in whatever hold she first rented at the Drift, before she met my grandfather, in the early weeks of learning what she was doing and why. She wrote that something about the sealed case had changed in her, while the sealed case had not changed. I think I understand that now. The thing you keep teaches you something about keeping. The practice of not discarding before you understand reaches back into you and leaves a mark. You do not know what the mark is for until you find what it was made for. She is in Bay 17. The pod is open, and its lining is still glowing blue-white, a quiet, constant light in the corner of the hold. My scanner has been recalibrated twice. The continuation index is being accessed in a way I cannot yet observe. I come in every morning. I say something. I get to work. Some things need keeping. The people who know that, I think, are the people things wait for.